Poštovani gledaoci, dobrodošli u još jedno izdanje emisije Granice istoka. Ja sam Harun Karčić. Savremena manifestacija hibridnog ratovanja nesumnjivo predstavlja veliki izazov državama koji su zadržale tradicionalno vojno i sigurnosno razmišljanje. U njoj, kombinacijom konvencionalnih i nekonvencionalnih metoda i uz primjenu vojne, ekonomske, diplomatske i informacijske sile, agresivni i destabilizirajući akteri pokušavaju ostvariti vlastite strateške ciljeve na štetu drugih. Vojne aktivnosti Rusije na teritoriji Ukrajine 2013. i 2014. godine izazvali su oštre reakcije širom svijeta i nametnule potrebu za izučavanjem hibridnog ratovanja. Takva koncepcija sukoba, koja se temelji na izbjegavanju klasične objave rata, obuhvata istovremenu primjenu širokog spektra konvencionalnih i nekonvencionalnih oblika djelovanja. Naš naredni gost je pukovnik Matthew Neumayer iz George C. Marshall Centra za sigurnosne studije. Colonel Matthew, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Now, sir, allow me to begin by asking you, I recently came across a report you co-authored for CSIS, but before we move forward, could you briefly explain to our viewers the definition and the evolving landscape of what you mean by hybrid warfare?
Thanks, Harun. Appreciate you asking me to come on today. I think the evolving nature of that phrase in your question is key. Hybrid warfare has many forms within the doctrinal phrases of the West. Irregular warfare, hybrid threats is a term. Hybrid threats specifically is a term used within Europe. Asymmetric warfare used to be a term of art for a while. All of that is to capture that this is a very complicated topic. When we talk about hybrid warfare, I like thinking about NATO's term, which is the fusion of conventional and unconventional instruments of power, the tools within those instruments, in a blended and synchronized way to achieve objective using the enemy's vulnerabilities. I think when you look at that, there's two main points to hybrid warfare that is important to highlight, and that is very important for specifically when the collective nations, democracies, open societies consider hybrid warfare. One is the important aspect is that the line between war and conflict and peace is blurred. This idea of a clean break between whether you're in war or whether you're in peace, or if you're in conflict with the nation, is deliberately a part of how those instruments of power are used and how they're synchronized to try to create that ambiguity. And that is important because our adversaries, autocratic regimes like Russia and like China, use this, they don't recognize this line between peace and war. They believe that they're in conflict and in competition at all times. And so they don't see a reason to acknowledge that. Now, our societies, representative governments, democracies, open societies, they specifically have rules and values and principles that they follow. This idea that conflict is not just something to be done at all times. And so that's an important distinction. The second distinction that's very important is the ambiguity and the lack of attribution, the trouble it is to attribute actions within hybrid warfare. So our adversaries deliberately try to operate in this term called the gray zone. Hybrid warfare exists in this gray area between peace and war, and it specifically takes the attributes within that gray zone to make it very difficult for us to understand who is doing exactly what. And that also adds this level of complexity that we specifically struggle with in this concept.
Now, Colonel, I'm speaking to you from Sarajevo, and over the past 15 years, this region has seen increased malign activities from Russia and China. And I was wondering, in your view, how can fragile democracies such as ours in the Western Balkans develop effective strategies to counter hybrid warfare tactics, including cyber attacks, including disinformation campaigns, including political subversion and economic exploitation and coercion? These are the vulnerabilities of countries that are in transition from communism to democracy, from war to peace.
Yeah, this is a very important aspect of hybrid warfare, is that our adversaries often, to be able to affect the collective good, try to prey on nations that are trying to implement democracy, that are fragile. And so their strategies are even more difficult to develop. And what we look at is the first step in our minds is assessing vulnerabilities. So very often when you try to devise a strategy, you look at your threat, and that is necessary. But you just outlined how our adversaries and how the threat is developing against countries like your own, how they're trying to exploit the fragility that exists and the hard work that your governments are trying to do to become free market, open societies, representative government of their people. So assessing your vulnerability and placing it against the enemy's threat gives you a sense of what your risk is. So for that first step of determining what your own vulnerabilities are in concert with understanding what the threats are, also gives you what are the risks to your society. And then you then can prioritize what you see as most dangerous to your government, to your society, to your people. And that's harder than it sounds. You would think, oh, I understand it's disinformation. That's a vulnerability. What's the most difficult part about it for countries, especially in places like the Balkans, within the Caucasus, and places where our adversaries are trying to gain advantage, countries have this fragility that admitting vulnerability can be a political liability. And so just identifying vulnerabilities can be difficult for a government. And so in doing so, they open themselves up to more exploitation in the gray zone. And also within their own political spheres, they have to take the risk to be able to say, these are things we need to correct. These are things that we need to address. Now, in the Marshall Center, we work with a lot of experts and participants from the Balkans, fantastic people. And they very often tell us about this risk to their governments. They talk about how that fragility, the relative newness of their representative governments, the effects of decades and centuries of ethnic and religious and political tensions, that creates a very difficult environment to develop a strategy. But if we can get to that first step, identifying our vulnerabilities in relation to those threats that governments like the Russians and the Chinese do, then we can start assessing the risk and starting to prioritize. And then you devise strategies that use the values and principles that the enemy is using against you. So, for example, freedom of press, freedom of speech is a key aspect of an open society.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, without that, a democracy dies, is to paraphrase the great phrase. From my perspective, those can be opportunities for us also. So governments, once they've determined what is the most important thing to them that they have to address, then have to look for ways that increases transparency, increases integrity within cyber, within the information sphere. They themselves have to be able to be open up and make sure that they are not only are they transparent, but they force transparency upon those who want to do evil to their societies. And once you're able to start taking actions and devising strategies to be able to do that, you can expose them, and then you have them reacting to your ability to protect your society. You educate your people. You degrade their ability to operate within your country, your region, and you take away the tools that they're using. And so while they're using the tools of open society, I mean, they're operating in things like social media because an open society allows them to do it. But then let's use that and create laws that make them expose themselves so that our people who are very smart and that we have to trust are able then to really debunk what they're trying to say.
Right. Colin Matthew, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Hibridno ratovanje uključuje državne i nedržavne aktere koji djeluju u nedefinisanim sivim zonama. Distinkcije između rata i mira, između onoga što jeste ratna zona i ono što nije, nestaju. Naša gošća je Hana Ljubakova, aktivistica i novinarka iz Bjelorusije, koja trenutno radi za Atlantsko vijeće. Hana, hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans channel, and thank you so much for taking time to speak to us. Now, allow me to begin by asking you, you have been extensively involved in monitoring and analyzing narratives coming from Russia and Belarus regarding the war in Ukraine, NATO, generally the reactions from the West. I was wondering, if these regimes often repeat the same narratives over the past years, or do you see an evolution, so to speak, of these narratives in the context of Russia's aggression on Ukraine?
Well, in general terms, not much is changing and not much has changed for the past decade. Take, for instance, the official Russian narratives about the mass protests in Ukraine back in 2013 and 14. Russia has consistently claimed that the US provoked the revolution and orchestrated the overthrow of President Yanukovych. This conspiratorial view has been used to justify Russia's actions in Ukraine as a form of resistance against supposed American intervention. Again, that was back then. What we're seeing now is that most recently Russian disinformation has escalated, and now it includes basically outright denial of the war. It justifies war crimes. It makes false claims about the use of biological weapons. A specific example that I came across recently is how disinformation campaigns were targeting Ukrainians that live in Poland, as an example, claiming that the rise of crime rates is associated with the fact that Ukrainians are in Poland, and so on and so on. So now, basically, the truth has become really distorted.
Now, compared to how things were in the Cold War, what has changed about how Russia seeks to exert influence in our current informational climate?
I would say that if we want to compare it to the Cold War era, Russia's approach to exerting this influence in the current climate has become more sophisticated and pervasive. Back then, propaganda was more straightforward. You could still distinguish, you could still draw clear lines between truth and fiction. Today, however, this is not really important anymore. Everything is blurred. Russia's strategy now involves a constant barrage of disinformation designed to confuse, divide, to undermine trust in Western institutions. One of the major shifts in how anti-Western rhetoric has moved from the kind of fringes of mainstream of Russian political discourse to from the fringes to mainstream. And this shift reflects a broader Kremlin narrative that portrays the United States or the West as a powerful but malign force. And Russia is basically the only sole power that is capable to deal with this force, and it shapes obviously not only domestic opinion, but also influencing the geopolitical landscape. So it became more mainstream, it became wider, and definitely it became, it involves many more narratives today.
Right, now you come from Belarus. Considering the intrinsic importance and significance of Belarus within the Kremlin's geopolitical calculus, how far do you think the Kremlin is willing to go in order to make sure that there is a loyal regime in Minsk?
Oh, definitely Belarus holds a very critical place in the Kremlin's geopolitical strategy. Some even say that it might be in a way more important than Ukraine. And of course, losing Belarus would be definitely a significant blow to Russia. The Kremlin sees Belarus not only as a loyal ally, but a key point, key piece in its broad ambition of regional integration. And this is something that the Kremlin would like to show to Russian citizens, especially those who have imperialistic ambition, that Belarus, is Russia's success story. But I wouldn't overestimate the Kremlin influence here. While the Kremlin is, of course, likely to go to great lengths to maintain a loyal regime in Minsk, we shouldn't overestimate its power. We have seen that Russia's army is not the second strongest army in the world. So, of course, there should be more political will from the EU and the US to understand that Russia is a threat to Belarus, but also resist Russian overreach so that Belarus is not becoming a consolation prize for Moscow's ambition. And there are several things that I would like to mention. First of all, what is really dangerous is Belarus' economic reorientation to Russia. And of course, this dependence will have long-term consequences, as we have seen in some other countries that are really dependent on Russian benefits and economy. The second thing would be this Russification and Sovietization of the Belarusian education at the moment, culture and history, and this is really extreme. And this means that these efforts are kind of shaping the mentality of the population. And what is also alarming is the potential, at least announced, deployment of Russian nuclear weapons in Belarus.
So if you could advise, Western governments, what strategies should the West deploy in order to mitigate Belarus's entanglement in Russia's broader strategic objectives?
As I have already mentioned, so first of all, definitely the West needs to recognize the threat that Russia imposes towards Belarus, and that Belarus is in danger. This is really important. Second is, of course, pressure. We have been talking about this. We analysts, we journalists, activists have been talking about this for years. Pressure has not been enough. And this kind of cost of repression and cost of international crimes that the regime has committed in the past years should be definitely higher for the regime. There is an army of enablers in Belarus, like security forces, prosecutors, judges who have not been sanctioned, like my judge who sentenced me to 10 years in absentia in July has not even been sanctioned. Second, what is also important is support to civil society, because people must not be isolated and civil society must be supported.
Now, very briefly, let's speak about hybrid warfare. So now the Russians define hybrid war precisely as a type of war rather than a set of means to conduct state policy. Now, the US discussion of hybrid war overly focuses on the means short of conventional forces and conflicts that the Russians have already resorted to, as we have seen in Ukraine since 2013 and 14. Now, do you believe America's current strategy for responding to the Russian threat is based on a misunderstanding of the Russian concept of hybrid war?
Oh, that's not, a brief, that cannot be a brief answer, but let me try. Well, I wouldn't say that there is a lack of understanding about Russia's modus operandi or Russia's tactics. The recent US National Defense Strategy from 2022 recognizes Russia as an acute threat. And not only mentioning this sort of conventional conflict, conventional war, or non-conventional military groups, but also such tactics as cyber threats, information operations, and extensive gray zone activities, as we have seen in Europe, really well and really widely. So I think there is this understanding that Russia is a threat and that Russia employs and uses various strategies. What I think should be done more is the priority that should be given to these issues and to this threat that Russia poses. And I hope that, of course, the US and its allies are not left vulnerable to such risks that Russia and other actors are posing.
Right, but what the West seems to have been quite slow in recognizing these Russian hybrid threats, at least in the Balkans, as far as we are concerned. There's been a lot of Russian, disinformation campaigns in Serbia and the Republic of Srpska, a lot of economic coercion, a lot of political subversion, and these are countries that neighbor NATO member states. We're talking about countries such as Bosnia and Kosovo, which neighbor Croatia, which is a NATO member state, and Montenegro, which is a NATO member state.
Whether this should be definitely increased or not, of course, I do agree that the US and the West should do more. There should be a more holistic approach to that. There should be this sort of understanding of hybrid warfare and what it means for Russia. It should be deeply analyzed. There should be definitely global focus on how to address Russia's actions globally, not only here in Europe, not only in Ukraine, but also, again, in such places like Syria, Libya, and Venezuela even. There should be more coordination between the Euro-Atlantic community, that's for sure. Of course, allies should be, should coordinate this kind of consistent responses and clear red lines for Russian actions. And there should be more counter-disinformation. Both the US and the EU, well, generally Western countries, Western governments can do more. They can expose proxies, they can look at the companies, but also organizations that are involved in this. It requires more resources and it requires more priority.
Right. Hana Ljubjakova, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Hibridno ratovanje često se opisuje kao rat u sjeni, koji se odvija izvan očiju javnosti i nikada nije službeno objavljen. Zemlje moraju osigurati da se njihova kritična infrastruktura adekvatno zaštiti od kibernetičkih napada. Stručnjaci naglašavaju važnost edukacije građana o taktikama dezinformacija i o tome kako sve informacije na koje naiđu na internetu mogu biti namjerno osmišljene da bi ih zavarale. Poštovani gledaoci, bilo je to sve u ovom izdanju emisije Granice istoka. Ukoliko ste propustili bilo koji dio, emisiju možete pregledati na našem web portalu balkans.aljazeera.net. Hvala na pažnji.